Hello, I'm David Temple, and welcome to The Thriller Zone, your front row seat to the best thriller writers in the world. A quick programming note. Do me a favor, would you, and swing by our YouTube channel, youtube.com/David Temple Author, and be sure to subscribe. We'd love to see you there. Also, be sure to subscribe at any of the places you enjoy your podcast: Apple, Amazon Music, Spotify, Stitcher, etc. Now, on today's 43rd episode, New York Times and international best-selling author J.D. Barker joins us to talk about his book, The Noise, co-written with the legendary James Patterson. Folks, this is a show chock full of useful information and outstanding stories. If you're a struggling writer who maybe wants to know how they can break through, stay tuned for some great insights. And if you're a fan of Patterson and Stephen King, get ready to hear some totally behind-the-scenes stuff you won't hear anywhere else. Right now, it's time to get into the Thriller Zone.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound delightful.
I'm like looking at my screen looking for the unmute button, and I guess it's already done.
Yes, that's a hell of an office, dude.
Thank you. Yeah, when I get locked up for things like COVID, I build bookcases.
Like, for real?
Yeah. My dad's
awesome.
a contractor, so I grew up doing that kind of thing. I built a really cool 2-story one in the other room with like a library ladder and all that kind of stuff on it. And now they're letting me back out of the house because I've run out of wall space.
That's hilarious. Well, listen, I think this could be, if I fuck this up, I'll really be embarrassed. But this may be my first time that I've got a New York Times and international bestseller on the show.
Uh-oh.
So, I bow to you, sir.
Well, I appreciate it. I told my wife when I got the New York Times thing, I was expecting music to start playing when I walked into the room or something to change, but no, I still have to change diapers, still have to wash the dishes. Like, it's like when you first write that first book, you expect, like all these big benchmarks to happen, and it's like it's very weird how they all kind of come about. My big thing now is like I hit number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list, which is something you can't put on the book jacket. Number 2 New York Times bestseller just doesn't work very well. I'm working really hard to try and hit that number 1 now.
Yeah, and people who say he's almost a New York Times bestseller, that it doesn't have quite the gravitas, does it?
There's so much that goes on behind the scenes to make that happen. That particular book I wrote with James Patterson, which helped. But there's they watch who's coming out on that particular week. Whether you're up against a series, whether it's other standalones, the fiction list, nonfiction list. There's so many different things that they weigh, and publication dates get juggled around, and it's nutty. Like, there's just so many different things, and it's like a total perfect storm has to kind of happen to make it all work.
Wow. Yeah, I was talking, I think it was Meg Gardner who said, you wouldn't believe, everyone thinks, oh, New York Times, you just sell a hell of a lot of books. And she said it's like a whole science to how it happens.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it's it definitely opens some doors, and brought in a new audience and stuff, but it's all very gradual. Like, I guess when I first started writing, like I've been in this industry for 25, 26 years or something now. But I worked behind the scenes as a book doctor and a ghostwriter for 2 decades. So I knew a lot of people that were New York Times bestsellers, and I actually had 6 different books that hit the list, all with other people's names on the cover that I had wrote or worked on. So I was very familiar with the process, but it's just like everything else. Like on TV and in the movies, you see best-selling author and you just assume they've got this giant house that they're worth $200 million and this and that, and that's not the case.
No.
Half my friends that that are also New York Times bestsellers are still working day jobs. It's a very weird dynamic.
What? Now that surprises me. I maybe you hit a stroke of luck and you're playing the right number on a certain day, and all of a sudden you get that position. But I would have thought once you hit that and you maybe hit it twice, or it's a misnomer. I guess a lot of us think, well, sure, it's prestigious, but I am printing cash, No,
I mean, it's like Meg said, it comes down to the science. But the traditional booksellers or the publishers, they kind of force everything to happen like when that first week of publication. So, they try to get the biggest possible of pre-orders, get you in as many bookstores, and they pay for the, those tables at the front of Barnes and Noble. All that kind of stuff happens in like the first or second week, and then they vanish. So you get this giant, like if you look at the sales chart, you get this giant spike, when that novel comes out. But then it comes crashing back down again. I mean, because something as simple as like the tables at Barnes and Noble, that costs $20,000 a week to be on that new release table. Last time I checked, it's not a cheap thing. So everything is just geared towards that first week of publication. So you get a nice payday, but then it tends to dwindle off. And I'm in a very weird spot because I'm what they call a hybrid author. I've got books with the traditional guys. I've got some that I've published through my own publishing company. I've got some that are a mix, where the English rights I retained and published on my own, but we sold the foreign rights to Random House and all the typical, usual players. And I'm in, at last count, 150 different countries and about 30 different languages. So my last 3 or 4 books are a complete mix of that, part self-published, part traditionally published. And that's, I think really helped me because as an indie author, when I'm basically in charge of my own publications, I don't necessarily shoot for that giant spike in sales at the beginning. It's more of a tortoise and hare kind of thing. I would rather see nice steady sales, over years and years than having that big spike. So for me, it all balanced out really well.
I'm stunned from the $20,000 a week for the table. I mean, that's.
Yeah, the entryway right before, after those doors is even more pricey, the alcove that they've got there. A lot of people don't realize that, everything is bought and paid for in today's world.
Well, JD, I know you've got, I'll run this down real fast because it'll be great visual later. 4 MK thrillers, 3 standalone novels, 1 Shadow Cove saga, and 3 with the one and only James Patterson. The latest with Mr. Patterson is The Noise, which we'll be chatting about today. But I'm just going to put this out there because I'm a little bit of a fanboy of both you and JP. And he is one of those guys that I grew up. I think he is instrumental. He doesn't know this yet, but I'll tell him that he's the guy when I started really thinking, you know what, I really want to craft my 3rd chapter of life, and it's going to be a full-time writer. And when I was just reading everything he was printing, I thought, this cat is a machine. And it's all riveting. It's great for flying across country because you can blow through a book in a sitting. But I gotta know, man, how did that connection with you happen on this book, The Noise, which we're gonna get to, which is, whoa. How did that happen? What's that feel like?
I've had a lot of weirdness in my career. So with the first book that I wrote, Forsaken, you've written a novel, so like it's all about getting that last page down on paper. And part of the storyline, I had to explain where the wife buys a journal. And just to get the book finished, I wrote that she walked into Needful Things, Stephen King's store, and bought it there, and fully expected to have to do a find, replace, and change that to some other name before we hit publication. But my wife is way smarter than me when it comes to certain business things. She's read the book and she's like, no, don't change it. Let's get King's permission to use it. And long story short, he read the manuscript and he gave me his blessing to go ahead and use that reference. So I've captured lightning in a bottle a couple of times. Bram Stoker's family read that book, asked me to write a prequel to Dracula using Bram's original notes, which was another one. While all that was going on, I was writing the 4MK series. And, one of the things you do in this industry is you try to get blurbs, those little 1-sentence descriptions that you throw on your book cover. This famous author said this about your book, and it's, usually something really, really riveting. So I mailed out a lot of copies of Fourth Monkey before it was coming out. And one of the people that I sent it to was Patterson. Never expected to hear back from the guy because, the publishers mail out a gazillion of these. I probably dropped at least 20 to 50 of them into the mail to people that I know. But, I'm looking at my own to be read pile on my desk or my table over there. And it's, it's as tall as I am. So I can just imagine how many books, people like King and Patterson and these guys are getting. But I never expected it to go anywhere. So I was working on, I think, the 2nd or 3rd book in that series, and my phone rang, and it was a 412 area code, which I know is Florida because I used to live in Florida. Florida. So I picked it up, and this voice comes on. He's like, "Hey, it's Jim Patterson. You got a second?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure it is. It's one of my buddies pranking me." So I'm sitting there trying to figure out which one it is. And meanwhile, he starts talking, and he starts giving me his review of The Fourth Monkey. And he got about 20 seconds in, and I'm like, "Holy crap, this might really be him." So turned out it was, and we talked quite a bit. And when I was in Florida next, I guess about a month or two later, he invited me to his house and invited me out to lunch. And I got to meet him, got to talk to him, and we started brainstorming ideas for a book together. But we kind of ran into a wall because I'm what they call a pantser. I basically come up with my idea for the book, my plot, just a general idea. Then I create all my characters. I make them as real as they possibly can be, and I just sort of drop them in this scenario and just kind of document what I see happening to those people. But I have no idea how the book is going to end when I start writing it. Now, Patterson, on the other hand, he's a very stringent outliner. Oh, yeah. So like the idea of pantsing a novel like that's unheard of in his world. He wants a total framework. He wants to know what that last page is going to say before you start the first one. So we had that lunch. It was a great conversation, but I don't think either of us actually expected it to go anywhere because our writing styles were so different. Then about a month or two later, I got another call from him, and he's like, "You know what? Let's try one, without an outline." So we did that. I was actually the first guy to talk Patterson into writing a book without an outline. And we had a ball. It's called The Coast to Coast Murders. And we just went back and forth, chapter by chapter, and we tried to one-up each other, and that was probably the funnest part about it. To give you an example, there's a scene in the book that had to happen, and you've seen it in every movie. So our protagonist got arrested for a crime. He's in the interrogation room with his lawyer on one side and the police on the other. The police leave him alone with his lawyer for a couple minutes, and they talk. And it had to happen because it communicates certain information that's necessary for the story. So I just wrote that scene and sent it off to him. And he sent it back, and he's like, "No, try something like this at the end." So I read it, and like he wrote at the very end of the scene, he's got our protagonist's attorney stands up, knocks on the door, and when the cop opens the door to let him out, the attorney grabs him by the shirt collar, bashes his head against the wall, kills him, and turns to our client and says, "All right, let's go." And like that's how Patterson handed the chapter back to me. He's like, "Okay, now your turn." So then I wrote the next one, painted him into what I thought was an even more difficult corner. And it took him all of like 20 minutes to write his way out of that and give me an even crazier one. So we spent this entire novel just going back and forth, trying to one up each other. And we ended up with this twisty and insanely cool, psychological thriller. So when we finished that one, a little time went by and we started talking again. We were trying to come up with an idea for something to do. And he sent me the outline for The Noise. And he said, "All right, we tried it your way. I want you to try it my way." So I read this outline, and I was hooked from the first page because he came up with a twist on horror that had never been done before. And on top of that, he had never written a horror novel before. So like the idea of working on that with them, there was no way I could pass it up. And he actually taught me quite a bit because, when you write books as a pantser, a lot of stuff ends up on the cutting room floor. You basically have to, you write this giant story. I usually end up around 120 to 140,000 words. Then I take out a good 30 or 40,000, kind of trim the fat and get to the meat of the story. When you work with an outline like that, you really don't have that process. You know how the story is going. The framework is there and it's tight. So that's basically what I learned on that second one. So I'm having a ball working with the guy where, he's teaching me an insane amount of stuff.
Okay. First of all, let me catch my breath because let me catch my mental breath because this is one of the best fucking stories I've heard on the show yet because, just let me be a fanboy for a second. You got you're an impeccable writer. You've definitely mastered the craft. And if you said you've been it in 20 years, then I can only guess you've been, you got right out of grade school and started. So that's number one. Insert compliments here. Number two, you got friggin' Jim Patterson, who is probably between he and Stephen King, the two most prolific writers as my brain can handle right this minute in this day and now. So you have 1 degree of separation from both of them. Next, you stole one of my questions. I had the great little setup, but you stole it beautifully, so I don't have to worry about that. But the legendary Stephen King, the balls, the tenacity, the confidence that you had to go, hey, look, I live by this motto. They can only say no. Whoop, keep going, right? So you took that to the next level. And I'm thinking of a couple of writers that I've had on the show who have said to me, "Oh my gosh, I don't know if I should try that because I'm not sure that will work." And I'm like, "What the hell? Just do it. All they can do is say no." So that's another one. As I'm catching my breath, is like that. That's one of the greatest lessons that I think some of my listeners can take away is that fear. That's false evidence appearing real. So just ask, and if they say no, keep moving on. So that's what a great story. I mean, yeah.
Well, that's totally true. I mentor a lot of writers, and I host a podcast of my own, and we talk about this all the time. Like a lot of times, especially in this industry, you only get one opportunity to ask a question. Like if you go to Thriller Fest, you may end up in the elevator with Lee Child, for all of 15 seconds as you travel
Right.
between doors. Are you going to talk to the guy and get to know him, or are you going to keep your mouth shut, watch the doors open, and watch him walk away, and wonder what if? I've never been afraid of asking the question because, like you said, the worst thing that can happen is they're going to say no. That being said, I hopped in the car and tried to go to Stephen King's house to get that permission. Don't do that. We never actually made it. I called a friend of mine, told him what we were up to, and he said, "Oh no, don't do that. Here's Steve's email address. Just send it to him. If he likes the book, you'll hear back. If the book sucks, he'll probably you won't hear from the guy, but just leave him alone. Don't go to his house. He hates that." And I've been on the receiving side of that since then. We've had a couple of fans that have just kind of shown up on my doorstep, and honestly, it's a little scary.
Sure.
I had one who, him and his wife, I was out on the back porch. My daughter was playing on the swing set, and they just walked around to the back of my house, and, they were standing on my back deck while I was reading a book before I even realized they were on the property. So it's weird how that's, like prior to that type of experience, it felt totally natural for me to just hop in the car and go to somebody's house like that. Nowadays, I would never even consider it.
I came from the part of the country that if you're standing out on your backyard and somebody walks in your property, you're going to have a gun in your hand. You're going to say, "You need to leave or I'm going to shoot you."
If my gun had been close at hand, that may have been the case. I'm in New Hampshire. You can get away with a lot of stuff up here.
Yeah. By the way, quick question, and I got to listen to it. What's the name of your podcast?
It's called Writers Inc.
Oh.
NK. Yeah, we're having a lot of fun because I've got a lot of contacts in the industry, so we don't get the typical guests. We literally just booked Gillian Flynn. We had Nicholas Sparks on a couple of weeks ago, so that's kind of the caliber of people, writer that we have on. But we ask them a lot of the same questions. We ask them where they started, what were they doing before they, started writing full time. What is their writing process like? What did they do to get an agent? But we're asking the names that you see on your bookshelves. And it's interesting, to hear from, some of these people. I mean, they all started, Stephen King wrote Carrie, sitting between a washer and dryer on one of those little children's student desks. Dan Brown lives right down the street from me. I mean, he wrote Da Vinci Code, before anybody knew who he was. Patterson, him too. Like he wrote a book called The Thomas Barrowman Number.
Oh, yeah.
Very few people have ever heard of that book because it fizzled and died. But at the time, he was working in advertising. He'd been around in marketing forever before along came a spider hit. And the only reason that book worked is because he went out of his own pocket and filmed a television spot for it. Hardcover came out. It didn't really sell that well. And he spent $500 of his own money and filmed a TV spot. And that's what really sparked the sales. So like getting that type of information out of some of these big names like that to me is gold. As an aspiring author, somebody that's somewhere in the mix in the industry right now, just knowing how other people got there, it's huge.
Yeah, it's funny. My first career was radio, and I knew from being a child that I wanted to do it. And I got to hit 5 of the top markets, all #1 shows in their genre. And then I've done television and film. And everyone that hears these stories, I'm not tooting my horn, I'm sharing a story, is that everyone thinks it's insurmountable. And when you stop and you go, I really want to do this, and I want to do it for the right reasons. It's not about the money. It's not about the prestige. It's not about the ego. I want to do it. I want to be creative, and I want to see if I've got what it takes. And if you have that in your mindset, I believe you can achieve anything. And yet sometimes we look at authors like musicians and artists and actors and so forth, and put them on this pedestal that they may or may not really deserve. And you made a really good point. You would go back and ask any of these cats, Do you feel, well, you'd never put it this way, but do you feel better than the next guy, or do you think you're hot shit, et cetera? And then to go, no, I just followed my dream and I kept doing it until somebody said yes. And another great little morsel I'm going to take away from this show, JD.
Well, I worked, I don't know how much of my backstory you know, but when I was in college, I worked for RCA Records. I was basically a glorified babysitter. But when the recording artists come into the South Florida area, I had to pick them up at the airport, get them to the radio station, get them to their hotel, get them to their concert on time, and get them back on an airplane when it was time to leave. And one of the people that I did that for a couple of times was Madonna. And she told me that we had a couple really good conversations, but she told me that she tended to zig instead of zag. Like that was her mentality. So when she had an album coming out, she would make a list of what everybody else was doing to promote their albums. And once she had that list, she would create a second list of things nobody was doing. And that's what she tended to focus on. So that, has always stuck with me. And one of the other things she told me is when she first decided she wanted to be a singer or get into that profession, she hopped on the bus and went to New York and got off the bus with like $10 in her pocket. Like there was no plan B. And a lot of times it takes, your feet to the coal in order to do that. I mean, even in my own case, like I was working a corporate job. My parents told me from the start, you couldn't make a living as a writer. So I have 2.5 degrees. And my last real job, I was a chief compliance officer for a brokerage firm. Which is as horrible as it sounds, but it paid really good. My wife and I had all the trappings of that. We had a big old house, we had cars, we had a boat. Our monthly nut was somewhere between $10,000 and $12,000, so we couldn't just walk away from that. So my wife came up with this crazy plan. She said, let's sell everything that we own. Let's buy a duplex in Pittsburgh, because she had family there. Rent one side out, live in the other side, and then live off of savings and try to make this writing thing work. We got everything down to nothing. I remember the day she showed me the bank statement, and she said, it looks like you got about 18 months to make it happen. Go. It did. I mean, my life literally changed in one day. Over the course of a couple of hours, I got a phone call from my agent when she was pushing the fourth monkey. She had told me that we got a preemptive offer out of the UK for, I believe it was $140,000. I ran home, told my wife we were going out to dinner. By the time we got to the restaurant, we were up near 600,000. And we had broken 7 figures by the time we finished dessert and left. So my life literally changed within the course of about 4 hours or so. All because I just, I wouldn't give up. My wife wouldn't give up. And, we just never took no.
That soundbite is going to be in my top 10 best hits of the year. What was that magical moment and that magical ignition switch? Was it, that sounds like part of it, that tenacity and just, I'm not taking anything away from being able to write a good story. So don't mistake that. But, and I was going to say, was James and or Stephen, were one of those two gentlemen part of that magical ignition switch? However, the fourth monkey, that was prior to both of them, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, Forsaken, I got a little cocky with that book because I knew how to write a good story, and you hit the nail on the head there. Like, you have to be able to write a 5-star book for any of this stuff to happen. Everything else is just, lining up basically a perfect storm of events. But I knew Forsaken was a 5-star read. And I knew that, when I had King's permission to use that reference, I thought it was a slam dunk. So I sent out, I think, 200 query letters to agents because I didn't have one at the time. I used a form letter, which was a bad idea. You don't use a form letter when you're reaching out to agents. So surprise, I didn't get a whole lot of responses back. And I didn't understand why, because I didn't realize using a form letter was a problem. So I ended up indie publishing that novel. But at the time, I made a conscious decision. I said, okay, if I'm going to do this, it's going to have to be on par with something coming out of Random House. I'm not going to just, hit the publish button on Amazon and walk away and see what happens. So I hired professionals across the board, editors, cover designers, formatters, and we released, exactly like a Random House book would. The hardcover and audiobook came out the same day, along with a soft cover. Mass market paperback came out 6 months later. I basically lined everything up the way I saw the big guys doing it. Somewhere along the way, Publishers Weekly got wind of my failed trip to Stephen King's house. And, I never actually got there, but the fact that I got his permission was newsworthy to them. So they wrote up a story about it. And that's honestly what kindled my career. That story came out. Forsaken ended up on the radar of a lot of people. Libraries started picking it up, bookstores started ordering it. It's over 250,000 copies sold at this point. So when I was over 200,000 when Fourth Monkey was basically finished. And I seriously considered just self-publishing that again because the economics are so good. But with that kind of track record behind me, I was able to go to the publishers and basically use those numbers. Like, this is what I did as an indie. What do you think I can do on your platform, kind of thing. And that's what really garnered, a lot of the advances and things that I got in the film and TV interest.
Couple things real quick here. I love the fact that you took the formula of the method of the big guys and simply duplicated it, because I don't know a whole lot of, let's see, I think my second self-published book, I did do a hardback copy, which was ridiculous at the time because I'm not sure I had enough heat on the first one, and the second one wasn't as good as the first one, so I really screwed the pooch on that. But that amazes me. And how did you have, well, it seems like a silly question to say, how did you have the foresight to do that? Except that's just really good business. Find out how they're doing it. And if you've got the capital, that's the key, then duplicate the process. Yeah,
I mean, it's honestly, it wasn't cheap. They took a big chunk of that savings in order to make that happen. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter what I'm doing industry wise. If I wanted to make a bicycle today, I would go out there and look to see what the best bicycle on the market was, and that would be my competition. That's the bar that I would shoot for. So that's kind of how I approach that.
I did not know that you were what some would call perhaps a hybrid thriller, and I think you mentioned that earlier about a writer, in that you write suspense thrillers and you fold in horror and crime and science fiction and even supernatural, like a good dollop of that is in The Noise. All of that I dig. How did you come up with that concoction? Was it something generic, or rather organic, like you being a pantser, to be able to combine all those genres and just make it work seamlessly into this tapestry?
Honestly, it was the same thing as, looking at Random House to figure out what their model was. I looked at who was selling the most number of books. And these are names that we all know. There's Stephen King, there's Dean Koontz, there's James Patterson. You can pick up a Stephen King book and it could be a Western for all you know. It could be a romance novel for all you know. People are buying it because it has his name on the cover, and it's guaranteed to be a good story because he's done it so many times in the past. So that was essentially what I was shooting for. So that's kind of a problem in today's world in publishing, because if you go to an agent and say, I'm not going to stick to a specific genre, or you try to tell a publisher that, they get a little freaked out. They want to be able to put you in a box from the get-go. An agent wants to be able to say he's a thriller author. The editor wants to be able to go to the marketing people and say, this is my new thriller author. Those marketing people want to be able to go to the bookstores and say, this guy needs to be in your thriller section. I didn't want to do that. So if you look at my publications, I'm purposely bouncing back and forth between horror and thriller. My Wikipedia page specifically says that I'm a suspense author because that was my common thread between all of them. And I tend to include, touches of science fiction, of this and of that. So I'm basically trying to paint that picture from the get-go. And a lot of that came out of conversations that I had with some of these authors, and just research. Like, if you look at James Patterson, yeah, he hit extremely big with Along Came a Spider. And then he had 4 or 5 books, very similar in theme, about cops chasing a serial killer. Then he wrote a book called When the Wind Blows, about a girl with wings. That didn't go over too well with his fan base because they were expecting another serial killer novel. Right. So I figured that if I keep bouncing back and forth, picking up fans as I go, they're all going to be on board for whatever I do, as long as I don't do something specific over and over and over again, which as an author, I don't want to do. I don't want to get trapped writing that same novel, over and over again. And I really don't care if that's the better payday. I need to enjoy what I'm doing. I need to enjoy that story that I'm telling.
That's an exceptional piece of advice. A lot of people are, like, I went to Thriller Fest back in 19, and you would hear a lot of the speakers talk about, find that niche and then lock it in. And while some of that I agree, like you make the point about a great income, steady income, but there's a big piece of me, like yourself, that if I thought I was going to have to write the same thing, just a new location, I'm not sure I could put my heart into it, because I don't know if it's either an attention span that leans more on the short side, or I don't know. It's kind of like we only have so much time on this planet, and there's so many things I want to do. I gotta believe you're the same way.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, like I think my agents definitely come around, and I think editors are finally starting to see that it does work, that you can do this. So we're having very different conversations. Like I know right now my core audience is female 45 and over. So my next book, I purposely didn't write a book geared towards female 45 and over. I wrote a book geared towards young adult. I'm shooting for late teens, early 20s. Yeah, my agent says I'm like a literary Pied Piper. Like I'm just sort of going out to these different groups because, if I write a sci-fi novel, I'm grabbing those people and I'm bringing them into my fold, and they're reading the next one, and I'm able to prove to the editors and publishers that people will bounce from genre to genre for a specific author. So I'm basically building that formula, and with each book it gets easier and easier. They're all kind of folding in.
Now, I realize JD, I realize you've been able to enjoy a great success with this, but it's such a so refreshing to hear some cat who's really made it happen and are saying, I'm going to forge my own path and have the confidence to do that, period. New paragraph. Quick question, because I was looking at your website, which is pretty beautiful. And who does do you have the same artists that do all your covers?
The last few I've been using a guy named Stuart Bache out of the UK.
Yeah.
Yeah, he does Mark Dawson's covers. He's done a couple Stephen King covers in the past. Really good guy for that. One of my big recommendations that I tend to throw out there is there's a website called 99 Designs, which I absolutely love. You pay around $300 or $400. You throw your blurb, your tagline and stuff like that, your description of your book out there, and artists will create covers for you, and you'll get like 40 or 50 totally different designs. Which is a very good way to try and figure out what you want that cover to be, because I suck at graphic design. I've got no clue what's good. The stuff that I like tends to be stuff that other people do not like. So like with Forsaken, when I did that cover, I had 10 different covers that came up through 99 Designs. I put them out on Twitter and said, if you were to walk into a bookstore and buy a book based solely on its cover, which one would you pick? The one that's on the cover is the one that I think it got 86% of the votes.
Wow.
It wasn't my favorite, but that was my thinking. Traditionally, you don't really get a choice. They kind of create the cover, they put it in front of you, and it's different in every country. So I've kind of given up that fight.
Well, Forsaken is an attention getter, and you may have seen a variation on a theme, but I'm looking at it right now. I'm like, yeah, I'd read that just based upon the cover, which is really hard to do. Now, side note, before I knew I could get you on the show, I picked up a caller's game because of my background. And this is one of those books that you open the page one, and this is a craft in and of itself. And I was jumping in a cab to go somewhere. I couldn't even stop. I was 5 chapters in before I could stop, because it is a continual scene, which is brilliant. So kudos to that, and I have yet to completely finish it, but it's great. Let's now talk about The Noise, which is your latest book, and I hope this is a compliment, JD, because it felt like I was watching an M. Night Shyamalan film.
Well, he's definitely an inspiration to me. When I write any of these, it's weird, but I kind of see it in my head as a movie. Sure. And I'm just sort of documenting what I'm seeing. Like when everything's working, when the machine's firing on all cylinders, that's what it's like. I'm watching it play out. I'm just documenting it. And when I look up, I've got 7,000 words down on paper, and I don't know how the hell that even happened. The Noise was very much like that. When you work with somebody like Patterson, he calls quite a bit. And even when he's not on the phone, every time I type a sentence, I can kind of feel him standing over my shoulder, snapping his fingers, going, okay, is that moving the story along? Is that moving it fast enough? What's the point of that? If it doesn't have a point, it shouldn't be there. Like this, and that kind of thing just it gets drilled into your head. So like the Noise, definitely has that caller's game. I was coming off The Noise when I wrote that. So it kind of gets ingrained in there.
Well, it's funny. As I mentioned earlier in the show, I took his online course, the master's course, and I think I learned more in that one course than I had learned a couple of years before. And you just mentioned 2 great takeaways that I learned from him, and I've integrated ever since. if it doesn't move the story forward, I mean, if a sentence doesn't move the story forward, much less a paragraph, take it out.
Yeah.
The other is, I love this. I call it, who called it? I want to say I'm thinking of, bear with me one second, Blake Snyder, Save the Cat. I think it was called the oh shit moment. So you'd have a oh shit, oh shit, right? And James says something similarly in that you gotta raise the stake, and then just when you think, kind of like the example that you gave earlier, just when you think, okay, well he's walking out the door, opens the door, punches him, kills him, opens the door, something happens. Now, I'd love to know what you did next on that, but that you have to constantly keep escalating. And that's the magic of him making you turn those pages.
Yeah, and that's, the more I do, it's becoming ingrained in myself too. Like, most writers, I think, tend to take the easy way out. If they see their character doing something, it makes sense for them to go off and do whatever that thing is. So they write it out, and that's the way that it happens. The problem is the reader sees the exact same thing. If your protagonist is expected to hop in a car and the car is supposed to start and he's supposed to drive off into the sunset, and that's what happens, it's boring. So like, instead you have him hop in the car and it doesn't start, or he tries to key on the lock and it doesn't work, or a crater opens up in front of him, but something strange has to happen. So anytime I find myself writing a scene where it just feels like I'm just moving a little too far in the straight and narrow, I purposely yank the storyline in a different direction just to see where it goes. And sometimes I'll do that 2, 3, 4, 10 times. It doesn't really matter until I find one that fits and that seems to work. It's funny because I run 5 miles a day, and I live on a little island off the coast of New Hampshire. So I see a lot of the same faces as I go. And they see me kind of mumble into myself and, pretty much pulling my hair out. And it's essentially because I'm trying to figure out how to get out of whatever I just put myself in, the next day when I sit down at my computer. But that's what keeps it fun. As long as I keep pushing myself like that, I know the readers are going to be entertained too.
And speaking of pulling your hair out, you do win the award for having the best head of hair on our show since we began. Thank you.
Thanks for that.
And so to go back to the noise, make sure I hit this point so that I don't give too much away, except the fact that folks are going to want to read this because it's a hell of a ride. Can you share the inspiration of the story and kind of, now you said that James kind of did the outline on it. So, but I know that you, even with an outline being handed to you from a master, something had to ignite in you that helped you propel it and move it along so quickly. And so let's talk about that story.
Well, there's an NDA with Jim that's about 10 inches thick, so there's only so much I can say as far as process.
Copy that.
He provided an incredible framework with that outline. Like I said, I read it, and he had touched on a topic in horror that had just never been done before, which is insane because everything has been done before. But he found an angle that was fresh. So that in itself was inspiring. I tend to ask what if a lot as I'm going. Like, what if this happened? What if that happened? One of the things that he gave me a hard time about is, his outlines come with chapter numbers. And, usually I'm about 3 chapters into the book before, I've got extra chapters, or this is happening, or I've moved something around. But, that's kind of the magic of it. Like, nothing is carved in stone. And when you're working with somebody like that, he understands when you're going in the right direction. He's, he'll back off and just let you run. At the same time, he'll stop you and hit the brakes if he sees you going off into the weeds. Which is good too. So, you said you took the master class. In a lot of ways, it feels like I'm still taking that class, except for Jim calls and tells me every time I screw up.
You've got the professor in your back pocket, so to speak.
Yeah, sort of.
I think it was a 60 Minutes episode that I saw on James, and you got to go into his Florida home and his library alone and his racks of files. It seems, if I recall, it's been a while, but it seems as though he has any number of stories with any number of writers going simultaneously, right?
He does, and it was one of the first things that grabbed me because his office is upstairs, and as we went up the staircase, there were manuscripts on the steps. as we were going up. And every shelf in his office had something going on, but like he knows where every one of those stories is. He's weighing in on every single one. He's writing on every single one. I honestly, when I first talked to him, I kind of figured that the process would work very similar to some of the ghost book writing books that I've done in the past. Somebody gives you a particular plot and they say, okay, go ahead and write the book and get it back to me. I'll talk to you in 6 months. It's not like that. He's extremely hands-on. He was involved in every aspect of everything I've worked on with him. Now, I can't attest to other writers. I don't know what his process is with other people. But he's involved from page one to the, until you type the end of everything that I've worked on. And that's been refreshing.
Yeah. And let's make sure I keep it about you, and that is this. So between your Shadow Cove saga, the James Patterson stories, your Dracula stories, the 4MK thrillers, I'm just curious, what is next for you? Are you going to bend another genre? Are you gonna add an extra thread of genre to your repertoire?
It's my agent's bugging me about that all the time too. So normally when I write a new book, I've got a PDF document that has ideas for stories that I want to write. So I share that with my agent, she shares it with my editors, and they kind of go through it and go, okay, this is something that would probably work really well a year and a half from now, because that's roughly when it's going to come out, or, when I turn it in. So that's kind of how it works. I'm writing books on spec. They pick an idea and then, I'm told what to write next. That being said, I'm still, trying to explore new things. I wrote a book called She Has a Broken Thing Where Her Heart Should Be, which is very similar to like if Dean Koontz were to rewrite Great Expectations, I guess would be the simplest way to explain that one. And in a lot of ways, I needed to write something that was a little lighter, a little bit more refreshing after writing the 4MK serial killer thrillers. Because I just kind of needed to scrub my brain out a little bit and get that stuff out of my head. Now that I'm removed from that, like I'm kind of eyeing those books and I'm going, I've got a couple ideas to keep that storyline going. So I'm considering, jumping back into that world. I've also got a haunted house type story that's going to be coming out probably in the next year or so. That's, what I like to think is an original take on that particular model as well. So, if you look at 4MK, the reason that book did so well is my serial killer dies in the opening of the book. It's no surprise. Like he's been operating in Chicago for 5 years. His signature is he kidnaps the girl and he mails body parts back to their family in a little white box tied with a black string. So he gets hit by a city bus walking to a mailbox with one of those boxes in his hand. So the police have him. They know he's dead. But he's got no identifying information on him. There's no ID or anything like that. They know that he just kidnapped another girl because he was about to mail that box, and they know that she's still alive because of what he's done to his previous victims. But they don't know where she is or who she is. So like, to me, that was an original take on the serial killer model, and I wouldn't have written a book in that world unless I knew I could do that. So my haunted house book is very similar to that. It's something very different that hasn't been done yet.
And who doesn't like a haunted house story?
You gotta love them.
Yeah. Well, I know you're in a tight schedule. You got 5 more minutes to play my little game, rapid fire questions.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. What's your favorite source of inspiration for your stories? How you find them is probably the best way to say it.
Ooh, geez. Probably just life. When I sit down and say, okay, time to come up with an idea, it never happens. It's always when I'm in line at the grocery store, when I'm out, playing with my daughter, when I'm doing something totally different, that's when the ideas pop into my head. So if you're an aspiring author, the trick is to keep your eyes and ears open. Those ideas are everywhere. You can find them in the newspapers. You can find them talking to your neighbors. Visit an old folks home and talk to somebody, and you'd be surprised what type of backstories they've got. A lot of people just don't take the time to do that. But stories are everywhere, and getting ideas is the easy part.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think listening is probably the biggest key, one of those biggest keys. I used to go to coffee shops and sit down and I'd be working on something, but I would start eavesdropping and I'd pick up more ideas just listening to the couple next to me. What's harder for you, JD? Is it draft 1 or draft 2 or the final polish?
I don't necessarily do different drafts. I've gotten to know Dean Koontz really well, and he taught me what his process was, which is essentially he sits down in the morning and he rewrites whatever he wrote the previous day and he cleans that up and polishes it. And then, you just kind of keep going when you hit that last sentence. So I've been doing that for a number of years now. So usually by the time I finish up that first draft, it's pretty tight. Aside from having to go back and, drop a couple of little sentences here or there to, like foreshadowing type stuff for things that happen later. But I haven't had a book where I've had to do like a full-on rewrite and multiple drafts in a really long time.
That's great advice. On the flip side, what would you say is your favorite part of the process? That sounds really general and broad, but everybody's got one little piece of the process who write on a consistent basis that they go, oh, this is one of my favorite things, whether it's research or creating characters or the bad guy's name, or what's yours?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably creating the characters and just getting them to the point where they feel like real people to me. Sam Porter in the 4MK series, I could drop him at the entrance to Disney World and I could tell you what ride he's going to go on first. It's got nothing to do with any of the books. It'll never appear in one, but I know him well enough as a person to be able to do that. So to me, that's the funnest part, fleshing those people out, taking, somebody that doesn't exist and, creating them out of thin air.
Brilliant. You seem like a guy, JD, that is destined for TV and or film. And if you had a chance to, we can call it executive produce, you find the pieces to pull together, or you're the director of one of your, let's just say one of your current projects, which would do you, like if you right now could, someone snapped a finger and said, let's go make it, which one of your projects would you choose to produce into a TV series or a film? And do you have an idea of who you would like to play your hero in that particular story?
Oh, geez. So I've been very lucky when it comes to all that. Everything that I've written has been optioned, with the exception of Forsaken. That's the only one that's still on the table. And honestly, it's funny because it's the Stephen King tie-in that's holding it up. That helped sell a lot of books in the beginning, but when lawyers get a hold of that, they're like, well, how do we do that without getting in trouble? And like, who do we have to get permission from? So it tends to turn off a lot of the players in Hollywood. They don't want the headache. But aside from that, like everything else has been optioned. I've got a couple TV shows in the works, a couple of movies in the works. The dynamic is constantly changing. I'm constantly getting phone calls saying this person just signed on. And then a week later, I'm getting another phone call saying this person just signed off. So from my standpoint, until I've got my butt in a theater seat eating a box of popcorn, I don't know what's going to actually happen.
Okay, then we can sidestep the second part of that question if you'd like. Final question. My wife and I have invited you and your wife, Dana, to our San Diego home for dinner, and you're welcome to bring 2 extra guests. They can be living or dead, and who would they be and why?
2 extra guests. Well, do you like toddlers? I would probably bring our 4-year-old because we have a lot of trouble getting a babysitter. So that would be one.
Okay.
Yeah, probably I've got one friend that's kind of stuck with me, throughout my entire life, from high school on. Probably him. His name's Ron. He's a truck driver. Can't talk anymore. A truck driver down in Florida for a grocery chain.
Okay. That's certainly one of the most original answers yet. All right, folks, to learn more about J.D. Barker, it's going to be easy website to understand, jdbarker.com, and Twitter. It's a little more difficult. It's at J.D. Barker. Thank you so much for this. This has been just astounding information. You got great energy. I'm very, very grateful for you taking the time. I know you're a busy man, but thank you, J.D.
Oh, I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Thank you, JD. We will keep our eyes open for what you have coming next. Now, folks, on Monday's special edition Thriller Zone, we're going to take a stroll off the standard path as we meet 2 LA creatives who are merging 2 of my favorite medium, graphic novels and podcast. Join me this coming Monday, the 31st, for episode 44 as we have Todd and Scotty from For Blood or Justice. Join me on the Thriller Zone.